Listen, I think I've got a problem. I think I'm addicted to mulch. It wasn't always like this, you know? Last year I was a recreational user, just applying a little bit of it here and there. But the more I learned about the nature of our soil here in Magnolia Bend, the more I became attracted to mulch and its amazing ability to keep the ground moist. Luckily, I found a way to fuel my addiction without ever leaving the property, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But first, let's talk a bit about the science of mulching and why people do it in the first place. Then we can explore some of the options for mulching material and consider their pros and cons in different situations. So without further ado, let's embark upon our journey into the Mulchiverse. Stay tuned, it's coming up. The power of our sun can be hard to wrap your head around. It puts out more energy in 1 second than humanity has collectively used across its entire existence. Some of that energy reaches our planet in the form of powerful radiation. This is, of course, what powers all life on Earth. From the heat that drives biological processes to the light that makes photosynthesis possible, our sun is a crucial component of all ecosystems. But it can also be a bringer of death. I think it's easy for us to take for granted just how well we mammals can self-regulate our body temperatures and thus acclimate to widely varying environmental conditions. That's one of the things that makes us great generalists. But most life on this planet doesn't have that luxury. It can only survive and thrive within very specific temperature ranges, and that's true of most soil organisms as well. Here's a 2013 study led by T.A. Sophie that looked at the effects of solarization on soil. Solarization is when you allow something to bake underneath sheets of plastic in direct sunlight to eliminate things like pests and weed seeds. In this study, they used polyethylene sheets to cover a field that had known pathogen problems, then allowed it to solarize for 80 days. The soil properties were tested at various intervals during this period. The study found that solarization did have some beneficial effects on soil chemistry by increasing the levels of certain elements. But it also dramatically reduced the populations of bacteria and fungi in the soil. These populations slowly increased following the solarization, but they were still much lower when compared to non-solarized soil measured at the same time interval. Solarization is an extreme example of what direct sunlight can do because the plastic sheets act like a greenhouse that traps water vapor and turns it to steam, which then cooks most life within the soil. But it shows us the potentially destructive power of sunlight on soil life. So let's look at a more realistic example of what sunlight can do to soil. This study, published in 2022 by Sean M. Weber and Company, explored the effects of various mulches on the soil of an apple orchard in England. The results varied according to the type of mulch, but what we're interested in is how the mulches as a whole compared to the control, which had no mulch. In this study, the soil that was not mulched had the lowest soil respiration, as indicated by this solid black line on the graph. Wait, what the hell is soil respiration? According to Wikipedia, it's basically the release of carbon dioxide by soil life. I guess they measure the outflow of that CO2 to estimate the biomass of microorganisms currently in the soil. It makes sense that more soil life would produce more gas, and less life would produce less gas. Okay, so the study found that all the mulches had a bit higher soil respiration than the control, with straw mulch being significantly higher. The control also had fewer earthworms, although the number of worms varied greatly depending on the type of mulch. These and other studies I came across suggest that mulching with pretty much any material has a host of benefits, such as retaining soil moisture, suppressing weeds, and protecting soil life. We've seen how it protects the soil life from harmful solar radiation, but what about the first thing, retaining soil moisture? If you've been following along with us here on the channel, you'll know that we recently discovered the sandy nature of our soil. Water passes quite easily through sand, both downward via gravity and upward through capillary action and surface evaporation, which means we have to water our soil a lot. especially when the weather is really hot and dry. Here's a study I found by Michael McMillan at California Polytechnic State University. By the way, all these studies will be linked in the description. Anyway, in 2013, Mr. McMillan ran an experiment on 3 types of organic mulch at 3 different depths of 5, 10, and 15 centimeters, which is about 2, 4, and 6 inches. He measured how each combination of parameters affected the amount of water in the soil over a period of 3 weeks. The results were quite interesting. The study found that a mere 2 inches or 5 centimeters of mulch reduced surface evaporation by 40%. Doubling the mulch depth to 4 inches further improved water retention by 10%, but increasing it further to 6 inches did not make the soil hold more moisture. So in their location, with their soil type and environmental conditions, a mulch layer of about 4 inches is optimal for keeping moisture in the soil. I think like most things, this probably depends on various factors. For instance, how finely the mulch is shredded will affect how well water and air can penetrate a thick layer of it. But this study gives us one data point to consider. Now, here's an anecdotal example from our own garden. I was having to water the well bed here pretty much every day when it had no mulch. But after adding a really thick layer of pine straw to it, that became a thing of the past. It's been 4 or 5 days at least since I put the straw on it, and it still doesn't need any water. So in our context, mulching is going to save hours of labor a week in the dry season. Of course, there is some work involved in harvesting the mulch in the first place. Let me show you how we've been doing it. Actually, before we do that, let me just take a moment to explain what we're trying to do here in Magnolia Bend. If you've seen any of our past videos, you might have noticed that we spend a lot of time and energy doing things that might not seem worth it from a financial point of view. And the same thing could be said for what I'm about to show you now. It's true that you can usually save a lot of effort by just spending a little money, depending on what's available for sale in your area and what your definition of a little money is. But the thing is that we're not so much interested in what can be done with a given budget. It's not really about money at all. I'll spend hours of my time to save $5 if doing so also increases my knowledge about how Magnolia Bend can help sustain our lives on its own without any outside help. Because that's what resilience means to me, being able to weather the storms regardless of what's going on out there. And that's why we've been experimenting with using what the land provides for mulching. We've got a nice stand of pine trees in the middle of our woods, with just a few deciduous trees in the area. So the pine needles are relatively pristine and easy to gather up. We've only been taking the top layer, which are the needles that fell most recently. There's another layer of half-decayed needles underneath that, but the forest soil needs mulch too, so we make sure not to take any of those. When I first tried this, I made the mistake of immediately putting the straw right next to those shelling peas we planted along the eastern fence. The next day, the plants had been ravaged by some snails. I don't have definitive proof, but I presume the snails hitched a ride in on the straw. So what I've started doing is spreading the harvested straw out on this concrete slab and leaving it in the hot sun all day. Then I'll rake it back up and apply it as a mulch. Since I started doing that, we haven't had too many pest problems. If you're going to collect some organic waste material like this on your own property to use as mulch, I'd consider taking the time to do something like this. It's also a good chance to pick out any large sticks or leaves that you don't want in the final product. You know, the main reason I didn't use pine straw at first was because I thought it might acidify the soil too much. But the thing about soil pH is that it's pretty hard to change it. That's why people use inorganic substances like elemental sulfur and limestone to adjust the pH of their soil. Organic materials just don't work fast enough to cause an appreciable difference over the long term. Here's some testing conducted by Scott Jacobs that provides evidence for this claim. His measurements on pine needles of various ages showed that while fresh green needles are fairly acidic, their pH drifts toward neutral after they've been rained on a few times. He also found that soil located under a thick blanket of pine straw actually had a higher pH than that of the soil from the same area that wasn't exposed to any pine straw. This result wouldn't make sense at all if pine needles had any real effect on soil pH. But this just goes to show that we shouldn't simply accept common wisdom without doing our due diligence. Something we hear a lot could be true, but we can't just assume that. Something else we've talked about in past videos is how we've been struggling to manage the ridiculous amount of leaves shed by all the trees on the property. We wanted to improve how we were dealing with them, so we decided to buy this little Toro push mower. This thing is 21 pounds or nearly 10 kilos lighter than our old self-propelled Honda. I've never found the self-propelled mowers to be that useful. They're a lot heavier, so they just sink down into the soil. Then the self-propulsion doesn't even do much, and you're just pushing around a bunch of extra weight. But what I've been doing lately is using the leaf blower to corral all the leaves into a flat corridor, like the one down by this old oak tree in the dip between the hills. I'll usually wait until the wind is blowing hard in the direction I'm trying to push the leaves, because that ends up saving a lot of fuel. Once I've got all the leaves piled up where I want them, I just mow them until they turn to dust. There's kind of a sweet spot for how thick the layer of leaves are when doing this. If they're piled up too high, the mower will keep getting bogged down. After a section has been finely shredded, I'll rake up the pieces and do one of two things: either put them in the compost bins or use them as mulch. We can talk about the composting aspect in another video, but here let's look at using the leaves as a mulch for our trees and shrubs. I've been trying to acquire some native shrubs to fill out our landscape a bit. Here's a Fothergilla major Mount Airy, which is a type of witch alder. There's only a couple species in this genus, which is native to the coastal plains and other wet regions of the southeastern United States. I wanted to plant it here along the eastern property line, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to wait to put it in the ground until after the fall when the weather cools down. So while I was trying to make up my mind, I decided to take the advice someone had given us in the comments of a previous video and prepare the soil of this area a bit by applying a thick layer of these shredded leaves. I used this magnolia sapling I had to fell a while back as a border to hold the mulch in place, because it would blow away quickly in these winds if I didn't. I let that sit there for a few weeks, but eventually I decided to just put the plant in the ground. I don't have to come over here and water it every day during the summer. I think it stands a better chance of survival if I give it access to the water and cooler soil underground. Back in March, Kiyomi and I also dug up and transplanted one of the azaleas growing wild in the woods back here. I'd never done this before, so I didn't have high expectations for its survival, but it seems to have made it out alright. About 3 weeks later, it already had new growth on it. But again, you can see how well these shredded leaves are working as a mulch for these perennial plants. I also shredded a ton of leaves and used them to mulch our citrus trees. Now, ideally, I'd like to use a different type of mulch for these fruit trees, and that is wood chips. There doesn't seem to be a lot of research on this, but apparently woody mulches like chipped bark and other tree products are mostly broken down by fungi, while leafy or green mulches are primarily decomposed by bacteria. In the case of long-lived trees and shrubs, fungi-dominated mulches seem to have the greater positive effect. Like I said, I can't find a ton of research on this, but I did find a study by A.L. McComb from all the way back in 1943, if you can believe it. Here they were investigating the relationship between pine seedlings and mycorrhizal fungi, which are organisms that form symbiotic relationships with the root systems of plants. He was interested in this due to problems they were having with growing pine trees in the prairie soil of Iowa, which lacks an inherent network of mycorrhizal fungi. When they observed the soil in places where the pine seedlings grew well, and the spots where they didn't, they noticed that the strong seedlings were always located in soil with a lot of ectotrophic mycorrhizae. Ectotrophic just means that the fungus doesn't actually penetrate the plant's roots, but rather lives in close proximity to it on the outside. So they did some more testing, and here's what they found. Seedlings that had established mycorrhizal relationships with fungi in the soil were taller and heavier than those that didn't. They also had more robust root systems. But to me, the really interesting thing was this. The mycorrhizal seedlings contain twice as much phosphorus as their non-mycorrhizal counterparts. This led the author to conclude that, quote, "The above data indicate that mycorrhizae, or the conditions which permit formation of mycorrhizae, were directly stimulating to root growth and activity, and that plants thus stimulated were capable of absorbing increased quantities of phosphorus, an element which was apparently limiting growth in this soil." So you can see how important these mycorrhizal networks are to plants. They literally couldn't grow pine trees in their soil at all unless these fungi were present. It makes sense when you think about it because pine trees have been around since at least the early Cretaceous period, about 130 million years ago. That's a long time for evolution to drive them in the direction of favoring these symbiotic relationships with soil fungi, which they've obviously done to their benefit. I think the idea behind using wood chips under perennial trees and shrubs is that it encourages the development of such fungal networks. Another benefit of wood chips is that they often have a very large particle size, which makes it easier for water and air to move between them. That's one downside to using finely shredded leaves like I'm doing here. In fact, I have to be a bit careful because I don't want to smother the shallow roots of these citrus trees by laying the mulch on too thick. It shouldn't be impermeable because that's just asking for trouble. The thing about citrus trees in our area though is that even though we're in zone 9, we do get hard freezes in the winter, which can be deadly to citrus. A thick layer of mulch should regulate the soil temperature in those situations and prevent it from dropping to dangerous levels. And in the summer, the mulch will have the opposite effect of keeping the soil cool. I plan to eventually get a wood chipper so that we can make our own mulch material from the huge amounts of dead wood produced by all these trees every year. But for now, these shredded leaves should be much better than leaving the soil bare. So we've talked about how mulch protects soil life and keeps moisture in the soil. But the thing that I hear people talk about the most when it comes to mulching is weed suppression. And to be honest, I haven't been super impressed with its ability to do that here, at least in the case of pine straw. I think that's partly because we're still in the process of building the mulch up to a deep enough thickness. But it's also due to the fact that our most problematic weeds, which include Bermuda grass and dollarweed, don't seem to care how much material they're buried under. They'll eventually find a way through it regardless. I mean, I'm sure the mulch is slowing the growth of these weeds just by limiting sunlight availability, so I guess I should still appreciate it for that aspect too. The finely shredded leaves do a lot better job at suppressing weeds, which makes sense because the particles of it are packed so much more tightly together. But like I said, it doesn't breathe as well as the straw. Another thing I like about pine straw is that it's so easy to rake all of it back so you can do some planting or whatever. It's just really easy to work with. But the point here is that pine straw just happens to be readily available to us. If we lived somewhere other than the southeastern United States, our preferred mulch would probably be different. Just like with composting and everything else, I think we need to look around us and see what makes sense to use for our given context. Along those same lines, I've been thinking about all this dead marsh grass that washes up on the high tides. I was hesitant to use it at first because I thought it might have a lot of salt and other contaminants on it, but I think that by the time it sits here for a few months and gets rained on pretty good, anything that was stuck to it has probably been washed away. We saw that earlier with the pine straw experiment that Scott Jacobs did, where a repeated cycle of being wetted and dried caused the acidic compounds to leach out fairly rapidly, after a period of only about 3 weeks or so. This stuff has been sitting here for quite some time, so I decided to test using some of it to mulch the largest of the southwest corner beds. It's a bit harder to work with than regular straw because there's some pretty long pieces in it, but it's not too bad. The real annoyance is the amount of plastic trash in it. Anyway, we'll keep an eye on this and try to notice any deleterious effects from the marsh grass. I don't suspect we'll see any. In fact, I'm fairly confident that the bed will do better overall now simply because it's fully mulched. Remember the study from earlier? Just 2 inches of mulch cut surface evaporation nearly in half. And we're already hitting the 90s here in early May, plus you can see how strong the wind blows around here. All that's desiccating the soil too much, so we have to mulch everything as much as possible. So far we've only talked about organic mulches, that is, using a material that will slowly decompose and disappear over time. That's all I can really imagine us using here in Magnolia Bend. But there's a few types of inorganic material in use as well. The one I see the most is plastic. I think this is used more in large-scale commercial operations, although maybe some home gardeners use it too. When used in conjunction with drip irrigation, it does have a lot of benefits, just like any other mulch. But it also has some heavy downsides, including its high financial and environmental cost. For us here in Magnolia Bend, those disadvantages make it a non-starter. Plastic has been used as a plant mulch since the mid-1950s, but there's another inorganic mulch that has been used for far longer: lithic mulch. This is when you use some sort of rocks or gravel as the mulch material, which humans have been doing for well over 2,000 years in locations as far-flung as Italy, Israel, China, and Peru. This paper by Richard Perriman describes how the Anasazi people of northern New Mexico used cobbles as a mulch in the gardens they built between 1250 and 1450 AD. Since lithic mulch doesn't decompose, those cobble mulch gardens are still populated by more native vegetation to this day, more than 600 years after they were built. There was also an interesting quote in this paper from another study by Crumley and Marquardt, who said, "In interacting with their physical environments, people project culture onto nature." When I read this statement, I thought about all the plastic trash that washes up daily on our shores. And that reminded me of the video from a few days ago of the Florida teenagers dumping buckets of trash into the ocean. If it's true that our natural environments become a reflection of our culture, then what does all this trash pollution say about modern society? Is this a culture we should be proud of? As you can see, the Mulchiverse is a realm of infinite possibilities. I don't think there's a best mulching material or approach because so much of it depends on your context. Are you in a hot, arid climate? Or is it cold and rainy? What trees grow naturally in your area? What does your pest pressure look like? Sandy or clay soil? It's taken us a year or two to figure out something that works for us, but I'm feeling pretty good about it. By sourcing materials from our own property, we're not only saving a lot of money, but we can put this stuff in our garden without worrying about what's in it. I hear stories all the time lately about how a grower got a bad batch of hay or straw or compost that had been contaminated with Grazon or some other nasty chemical. Sometimes you got no choice but to outsource material, in which case you just gotta do as much research on the seller as you can and hope for the best. But if you've got the time and resources to produce it yourself, that's probably going to be the safer bet. Alright, that's all for this one. Thanks for watching, and until next time, good luck out there.